Okay, we're getting one little wire that will help me show pictures, or that most of the pictures are just words, because all that has is a half an hour to figure out what is architecture. As soon as we get those, we can start. I would say this is the biggest audience I've had in a long time. Yeah. So we want to see more of you on every other day of the week. So this is what our assignment was. I suppose it's a question you should know, but I didn't, and so I decided to consult some experts. So this is the answers you'll get. It's frozen music, according to Goethe. The masterly correct and magnificent play of volumes brought together in light, Corbusier. The will of the epic translated into space, Nice. The art of how to waste space, Philip Johnson. Everything, for Hans Hollein, everything is architecture. Shelter with decoration on it, Robert Venturi. The fashion trade of the building industry, Colin Rowe. So you will no doubt spend the next 4 years, 6 years, 50 years of your future careers, and there will be, dozens and dozens more definitions of architecture, just to show that it doesn't exactly mean we don't know what we're doing, but it does mean that what architecture is open for grabs and will be redefined by whomever for whatever purposes they need. And you will enter that discussion, and entering a field is partially entering that discussion and being able to figure out a definition of your own. There is no essential definition in a certain sense, as this makes clear. But I guess there's also, you could say, another way to think about what architecture is, and this would be the boring way, but there's the professional definition. But the professional definition more or less tells you who gets to call themselves an architect, not exactly what architecture is. So you go to your accredited school, do your internship, sit for the exam, pay your dues. The state will license you to become an architect, and you can call yourself an architect. That may or may not mean what you do is architecture. There could be architecture that happens by people who are unlicensed individuals, as the board would like to call them. And there'll be things that you do as a registered architect that don't constitute architecture. So, sort of like what the role, what your professional description is I would say not the most interesting way to figure out what architecture is. But at least you could say one of the things about the professional identification of the field is that at least it understands architecture to be a professional service that's given. You could say it's not a thing. It may not result in a building. It may actually, it may not even result in a success. It may result in a failure. But primarily what you are doing is communicating through drawings and words, through contract documents, construction documents. You're giving instructions to someone else and overseeing its completion. So really, you're bossing people around and making sure they do it right. That's what architects do. So welcome to that. But because really you're not, everybody says, oh, we make buildings. You don't actually make buildings, you make documents. You make drawings with specifications and words, and somebody else does them and you make sure they did it properly. That's pretty much your legally defined responsibility. So I think that one of the issues is that, you might make things, but for sure you're always drawing things and writing things. And so, if you go back to, this is a definition by Rainer Banham, who says that architecture is not the whole art of building everywhere, but just the making of drawings for buildings in the manner practiced in Europe since the Renaissance. So Banham basically says, tries to stop the idea that you want to put everything that's been ever constructed on the crust of the earth since everywhere, all time, under the category architecture. It doesn't make sense. Architecture is a specific approach to how you think about designing and building things, that not everybody who designs and builds things actually works that way. So it's really a manner of working, and a manner that privileges drawing, whether it's by hand or by the computer, doesn't really matter. How you specify, you move from a kind of abstraction to its specification for someone to materialize in the world. And it's architecture, frankly, whether or not it gets materialized in the real world. It's still architecture. The kind of joke that Banham gives about this is, when asked for a pencil that could be used to tighten the tourniquet on the limb of a person bleeding to death in the street, the architect carefully inquired, will the 2B do? This is clearly a joke that only works in the analog era when you knew what a 2B pencil was, but certain weight of a pencil, certain hardness of a pencil. But basically, the concerns of the architect are overly invested in certain things, representation, the techniques and tools of their trade, and they sort of overlook the fact that someone might be bleeding in the street, because for them, their fixation is a very precise thing, which in fact no one else in the world just cares about, and that's a good thing that we should continue to care about those things, because we're the only ones. I think that it's the joke about the architect who can't think without drawing, or without a pencil in his hand or her hand. That the role of the architect is really a kind of geometrically driven one in that way, or at least a diagrammatic one. But to get to where I think the definition is, I got 3 points. One of which is a cultural practice. What does that mean? It means it's more like music, art, literature, film, poetry, than it is like engineering, business, medicine, law, sociology, policy, construction, and development. You're in a field like music, art, fashion, literature, film, and poetry. That's what architecture is. You're a cultural producer. You're not like those other fields, or those other professions, or those other disciplines. And so for me, what makes architecture is not about the immediate satisfying of needs, but basically the staging of alternative ways to show how needs have been satisfied in incompatible ways over time, and basically projecting alternative ways. So what does that mean? It means, I think that architecture is a world-making activity. It's a form of world-making. That's what you do as a cultural producer. You make alternative worlds and try to seduce and solicit and cajole as many people into your world as possible. So part of it is somebody else gives you needs, and you need to turn those needs into desires. Right? Somebody gives you a list of needs. I need these things. You have to make them desirable. Or alternatively, you project desires and fantasies out there that sometime down the line, another group of people start to think of as necessities or imperatives, that they can't live without them, even though they never knew them before you drew them and made them as possibilities. So the issue is, what is the world-making activity that architects do? I mean, I think that in a way, the one way of working is that I think architectures make the platform, or establish the platform, for the ways in which people, objects, events, and environments connect or are held apart. That's nothing more and nothing less than that. We allow peoples and objects, peoples and events, events and environments, people and environments together to combine or be separated. That's what we do. That's the nature of our practice. To envision ways that those things could be recombined, connected, separated, held apart. And we do it through the devices that we have in our field to do it with. In other words, it's not just every which way that we do it, but that we do it through thinking about what is the relationship to a ground, i.e. what is the relationship to the exterior, to nature. What is the way in which you proceed through a building or move through a project or move through activities? What is the way you zone activities or connect activities or programs? What is the way you establish envelope or distinctions? What are the kinds of layers and different ways you can establish envelope or barrier between different situations? It may not be the whole of the world, but it's not bad if you want to start making worlds. Those are a pretty good set of techniques to have at your disposal. And also, I think, maybe the last one, maybe the necessary condition in some way, which is to be able to think about the other ways that it could happen as opposed to or in addition to the way it is happening. Which to me means that when you enter architecture, and you can enter outside, not necessarily inside, but basically an encounter with architecture should allow you to become somebody else. In other words, that the way in which all of those relationships between you and objects and other people and environments happens puts you in a world that you didn't know existed before your particular experience with that way of doing it. Because what architecture should do is show you there's other ways of organizing the world than the way that you normally occupy. Therefore, you can become somebody else. So what else? I think the second thing, and maybe this is really the foundational thing, is that architecture is a discipline. And by that I mean it's not a medium, i.e. architecture does not equal building. And if I had another diagram, I would show it this way. I think that there are media, like building is a medium, drawing is a medium, painting is a medium, film is a medium, books are a medium. Great. That's how mediums operate. Disciplines operate across that. In other words, there's part of the thing called architecture that occupies the world of drawing, part building, part books, part films, part painting, part whatever. In other words, architecture occupies media horizontally, and you can carve up the world of those things. So you don't want to identify yourself with any narrow one medium. Like I make books or I make buildings. Basically, as an architect, you do a lot of things, and it's how you do them architecturally to raise architectural issues that's what makes it architecture, not what the medium is. And that's what I mean by it matters less what gets done than how you do it. You know, lots of people can build shelter or have a house, keep the rain out. So that's not really what architecture is. What architecture is how you do those things, not what that you're doing them. And so, for me, that means to be a discipline is first and foremost, architecture is about other architecture. So my definition would be architecture is architecture, as illogical and redundant as that seems. It's sort of the fact, which is to say, if you are doing architecture, it is always necessarily about other architecture. That's just how any cultural field works, any discipline works. So, Scorsese and Tarantino, for example, two great filmmakers, all of their movies are about other movies, first and foremost. You might be entertained by them, you might enjoy them, but what they are doing as experts in film is making movies about other movies. High movies, low movies, old movies, new movies, doesn't matter. Movies that didn't get made. And that's what you do as an architect. Your job is to have that kind of knowledge about the field that allows you to shuffle and remix your field and take it somewhere else. But the material you're working with as architecture is all the other architecture that's happened or could have happened or didn't happen or what's made possible by other architecture. That's your medium. It's what you're working with. And so it's not, it shouldn't be an embarrassment. This is how everybody in a cultural field operates. The rest of the world doesn't need to know their knowledge, the fact that Martin Scorsese and Quentin Tarantino are film nerds, but you need to become architecture nerds to be able to do that. If you want to be the architectural equivalent of those film directors, that's the kind of knowledge you need to embody because that's what you're doing. That's what it's about. So if you look at this, the Venturi House, which where you are in your history surveys yet, but you will see at some point many times. And this is a quote from Howard Bloom. Strong poets make poetic history by misreading one another so as to clear imaginative space for themselves. I think that's, like poetry, like film, like architecture, what you're always doing in your act of making something is having a dispute with somebody who came before you. Or basically you're creating the people or the projects that came before you. And that's being expressed, you're reconfiguring what went before you by what you do. So that you're always in an argument with someone in your field. It could be, you love what this person did or this project does, or you have, didn't go far enough or went too far, but that's the, what you're always doing is misreading other architecture to make your own architecture. So, the Venturi House, not possible without a particular mixture, you could say, of mid-16th century Michelangelo, Palladio, late 19th century Buchanan and White, mid-20th century Moretti. That there's a set of projects that Venturi has in mind in terms of that this project is not conceivable without, in a sense, referencing all of that stuff. And why do you go back? You go back because you feel that you need, as Bloom says, to create imaginative space for yourself. You need to create a space where you can operate as an architect. And you look around because, to say that architecture is not consumed or exhausted or primarily defined by your immediate needs of the day, you have to say, okay, so what gives me escape velocity? How do I avoid simply becoming a servant or a service industry to a whole bunch of demands that are coming at me? And the answer is, it's your discipline that gives you escape velocity. In other words, your ability to go back and recuperate something that wouldn't be conceivable at this moment by all of the parameters and forces, but that you always need to keep a double set of books on whatever you do. Yes, you will have a client, they will put a lot of demands on you, but the important things you do will not be addressed by the client one way or the other. They won't even know what you're doing. You have to have integrity and discipline about what those things are that matter to you and to your field and your colleagues. And the client, basically, their needs can be satisfied in a number of ways. How you do it is what makes it architecture. And how you achieve escape velocity from today is partially by going back to yesterday and reconfiguring it in a new way as a way to say, this, because in any moment in time, your options will be foreclosed. So going back and recuperating something is actually a gesture of freedom, not a gesture of constraint. So you could say you're using figurative projects as your sources, but it's not just about references, it's also what you have to work with as an architect is technique. In other words, you have an internal set of techniques that are your techniques, and that in a certain way, it's not, again, those external demands and constraints that dictate what you do, but basically, Corp says the plan is a generator. In a certain sense, your technique is a generator. Drawing is a generator. Just the act of drawing and redrawing and doing different things. Drawing is not a way to represent some idea you have. Drawing is a method to figure it out and actually to project what it's going to be. So this is a kind of example from Peter Eisenman. This is House 10. It's an axonometric drawing on the left, so it's in parallel projection. Everything is measurable, metric. So it's not perspective. So the point of view of an axonometric is that the object is, you could say, the subject of it, not you as a perceiver. So in parallel projection, it's metrically, you don't lose anything by a perspective. Why is that interesting? Because this then is what he calls an axonometric model. Now, there's no such thing, or at least there was no such thing until we invented it. And so, it looks like a photographic model. If you take a photograph of a typical model, the camera would necessarily lose information metrically in perspective. So parts of the model a little further away from the camera would be smaller than parts of the model that were in front of the camera, even though they were the same dimension. This is a model where you can take dimensions off and it will be the same in both places. That's why it's an axonometric model. It's a drawing technique turned into a three-dimensional object. In other words, drawing is the project. In other words, the technique of drawing becomes the way the model gets made. In other words, you basically, you could say, evidenced the documentary, graphic, two-dimensional aspect of drawing and architecture into a three-dimensional object. And so you say, okay, big whoop. Or how did he do it? In other words, it only works as an axonometric when it's taken from a camera from a single point of view. So that if you look at the model anywhere else, that's what it looks like. In other words, the entire model had to be made in an oblique, collapsed way in order to operate as a drawing. And so the idea that somehow the drawing technique is dictating the object. In some way, that's what architecture always does, which is to say that this is a kind of mannerism of that, perhaps. But it's the idea that how can I get what I do, which is draw and notate and make instructions and specify, and overlay it with the real world. And sort of both overlay it and make it evident that there's two things there. There's a thing that's there solidly, like the model, or ultimately the building. But there's also another set of things that are present in that, which is how you notate it and the conceptual aspect of it. So how do you exaggerate, you could say, the graphic documentary quality of the object, even when it gets translated into a model or a building. This is another, definition of architecture. If you see a building with windows of a size to admit the appropriate amount of light, it may or may not be a work of architecture, but if the windows are definitely too big or definitely too small, then you can be almost certain that you're in the presence of an architectural endeavor. I think it's also a really good test. Big, weird windows, too many small windows. You could say the same thing with structure, so columns. You got huge columns, columns that are too small, columns that are too big, columns that are overscale, stairs that don't go anywhere, house and house six. And this is what architects do, right? They make stuff too big, too small, stuff that doesn't go anywhere. And that's, in a way, that rhetorical or mannerist aspect is one of that active exaggeration, which makes you realize, that puts you in a state of mind to say, it's not just this dumb thing that I ignore, but actually I have to think about all the other times I've seen something standing up or being held up, or the other instances of such a thing. The other definition of architecture, it leaks. This is what clients say. How do I know it's architecture? It leaks. I would like to take that insult as a badge of honor. I think it's good that it leaks. You will get other people here who say that, in fact, that's the only job, is to make sure it doesn't leak. That's what I call building. But why does architecture leak? Why is that the joke? Partially it's because architecture exceeds at any moment the technical capabilities at that particular moment of an industry or construction trade. In other words, before things get codified, if you're trying to do something differently and against the grain of materials and technology and fabrication techniques, things are going to happen. That basically, part of what I want to say is, what is architecture's relationship to technology? Because it's not, we don't do technology. We appropriate it, employ it. We have cultural ideas that in some sense are often in advance of where technology is, and the technology will catch up to us. So, Frank Gehry may have been doing crumpled buildings for a long time, or his desire was, but in a certain sense you have to wait until material science and technical ability and so on catches up to what is a disciplinary problem deployed in the discipline, but actually doesn't get realized till much later, because in a way architecture throws out things and the rest of the world, if it's a desirable thing, catch up to it, to enable it. And that's also what we do. But the kind of relationship to technology is, and this sets up the third and last point, is a strange one. I mean, architecture have a kind of fetish of technology often, and so whether it's, in a way, Corbusier was trying to suggest the kind of status of the monuments of the past, of old architecture, is maybe manifest in the technologies of transportation and efficiency today, say cars, but also boats and planes. The Venturis do a similar move, which is sort of almost saying the same thing in this case, Arthur Constantine, and equate it with this Tanya billboard in the Las Vegas Strip. So Corbusier in the 20s was saying it's mechanical technology, Venturis are saying it's really media of communication technology in the 60s. But they're constantly aligning architecture with a particular model of technology, you could say. And so the third point I want to say is architecture is slow. How is it slow? It's slow because it takes a long time to get built. I mean, one thing is you can have an idea and it may not be realizable for 20 years down because the financing and technical standards aren't there. It doesn't mean you can't ideate architecture. You're supposed to, that's your job, and project, maybe it doesn't have a horizon of viability for 10 or 20 years. You could do a competition, and between doing the competition and potentially winning it, and actually opening it, could be 10-year period. The old joke that architects' careers don't start until she or he is 50, also long time span. I think the material investment also means that this life cycle of architecture, at least, is much longer. But that's what I find really funny about this image, which obviously you don't find funny because you're not laughing. But the point is that when this photo was taken in the 20s, the architecture is supposed to show how modern and contemporary it is by that car. Get it? Now we look at it and say, that's a great new building. What the hell's up with the 20 antique? You know, in other words, technology is at such a rate of speed that, you know, the architecture stays fresh, even though the technology, in this case the car, becomes obsolete. And so we find it funny that at some point this was a sign to say how up to date my architecture is, when all we can say is like, who parked the antique in front of that building? And you know, the architecture's, you know, its ability to, you know, precede technology, meaning that, you know, it leaks the sense that we project work that is not yet technically feasible, but will become technically feasible. And it will become technically feasible precisely because we projected it out there. But also, when a technology dies that we think we associated our work with, it doesn't matter. The building is still fresh, even though that technology is obsolete. So don't run with technology. That's the conclusion. For me, the relationship is like a picture of Dorian Gray, which is that Dorian Gray always stays young, but the picture ages. Well, in this case, architecture stays young, but the technology ages. That's our Faustian bargain with technology. That's it. Thank you. Cultural practice, discipline, slow. I got 5 more hours of material to it. And then it'll be those 3, something else. So did they tell you this already? I remember taking a 3rd-year undergrad theory class, and when I explained that like, architects don't make buildings and make drawings, it was like, why didn't somebody tell us this in the first year? And now you know. I can take any questions. Yes.
So who's your favorite filmmaker and why?
Well, you know, I do like sort of some interns, you know, obviously that's why I put him there. It was partially an interview in the New York Times with Tarantino, where the interview was saying that people say you don't engage the real because your films are about other films, and it just seemed like a ridiculous thing to say. Like that somehow, A, what is a film that engages the real, and secondly, I think that you have an effect in the world. First of all, to have an effect in the world, you have to be true to your knowledge base and your field. And so, the fact that they are nerds, I like the fact that they're experts and nerds in their own field. In fact, Brian gave me a documentary that Scorsese did, which was great. I suggest some of it to you guys. I like Peter Greenaway, but that's probably because he's a frustrated architect and does very artificial, mise-en-scenes. I like the artifice of that work. I mean, Tarantino also has artifice. I like work that exaggerates its artifice, basically. And it can be jokey and ironic, or it can be more plastic, or more subtle, or more minimal. But there's no. What I like is work that suggests that you've entered a new world. Like let's say Wes Anderson would be another one. You enter a world, and you're in Wes Anderson's world. And it has its own rules and its ways of behavior and its narrative structure and its environments. And I think that the idea to be transported into another world for a while to show that the one that we're in is merely contingent and conventional and can change, which I think is great liberating feeling. The fact that everything we take for common every day is, we either should value it because it's not forever, or if things are not going so well, they can change, and in fact we can rearrange them. So I like cultural forms that demonstrate artifice, the fact that they are, that we're all just working with conventions, and that we can agree on different sets of conventions, and the world will change. There's nothing natural about it, nothing necessary about it, which is why I don't want to be a field like engineering or law or medicine or the other ones.
Why are you here instead of at a firm?
No firm. I'm going to send my CV to Chris. And that's the response I get. I think we all end up in different places. Because I think architecture is a cultural practice and a discipline, I think the best place for me to practice it is in the context of a school. And I think it's harder to do in most offices. So, what I enjoy about architecture is that you can, design something one day, write the next, teach the other day, go travel and, find some weird thing that you then bring back to architecture another day. The fact that you could wear many hats. And so for me, I get bored easily, and so I need to be able to shift the things I'm doing. And so, when I had a small practice, I liked to design, or collaborative design. That has not happened, but neither has writing recently. So, I think designing an institution, as I've said before, is a design problem. And, that's why this is, more interesting to me than firm life. But I think one thing is that you shouldn't think that it's an argument about school versus practice or the academy versus practice, because, in my experience, there are many more interesting offices than there are interesting schools. And so, there's a lot of schools I wouldn't want to have, I wouldn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole or go in the vicinity of. I think a lot of, I think there are probably some offices like that too, a lot of them. But I think there's also, very experimental offices that are pushing the boundaries of what you can do through the medium of architecture, and those are interesting offices. And I think there are also schools that are doing that, and those schools and offices come together, and the schools that are doing more normative things come together with the offices that are doing more normative things. So, to me, it's just like, how are you practicing in your field? And there are schools that do that, and offices that do either of those things. So.
Is architecture harder as a professional? Like, do the workload feel more tough as a professional? Or as a student, it feels tough because you're young at it?
Is the workload harder as a student or when you're in an office?
Do it feel harder?
Does it feel harder? Wow, I don't know how it feels. My motto is I'm running a school so I can avoid work. I think that part of the reason it probably feels hard in the first years of an education, you can have graduate students here too, it wouldn't matter really where you were beginning, but is that you are being introduced immediately into this other world, and part of it is not just transferring knowledge and techniques, which it is, but it's also, frankly, an act of socialization. Like, you're being introduced, architecture is a tribe with peculiar habits. And one of the things you are getting indirectly, it's not the content of the curriculum, is what are the things that this weird tribe seems to be preoccupied by and why? Why would they have a fight over, the size of a window or whatever? What would motivate that? I think it feels like a lot because you're in a foreign country. And so you have to learn the language that you don't know, and you don't know the traditions, and so you've been just dropped into Slovakia. I think once you're in an office, those habits, those rituals are clear, and so, you enter a field like this, and it is a 24/7 thing, not just as a student, but that, you know, when you work in an office or start your own office, or do your hybrid activities, you know, it's a lifestyle choice, and it's a 24/7 thing. It's not. At some point, you will stop thinking of it as work, like when you first go out and run and swim, and it feels like work. At a certain point, your body will set off pleasure senses. You know, like, oh, okay, I get this, I like this now. You know, but it is, you know, it feels like work at the beginning, and then it just becomes addiction. Or you will get off it.
So right now, do you get a lot of time to sleep?
Some members in the front row will understand. I have a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old, so the answer is no. Beyond 200 18-year-olds or whatever.
Okay, so in the beginning you mentioned a bunch of quotes. Which one personally like represents your perspective?
Of those?
Yeah.
You know, none of them. I think they all have. I mean, I think they all make sense in some way. I mean, you know, I have to say, I love Corbusier. I don't get that one at all. And Gerrit de Frozen music. Somebody else said that make music melted architecture. But you know, I think I understand Mises. It's a little bit too much bravado, but the will of an epic translated into space. I mean, I think there's probably just not one will of an epic. I mean, I think it's basically saying, you know, that architecture is one way to express the demands and desires of subsets of culture, and that's one way to express a particular confluence of those things. I think Johnson is right, you know, when he said bluntly, it's how to waste space. In other words, I do think that there's necessarily in architecture something that is excessive, and that not every corner, not every space can be accounted for metrically. And if you try to, you know, it doesn't pencil out. And so, in fact, it is, you know, like music, like art, like painting, like literature, you know, at some level they're not necessary, so therefore they are by definition excessive, and we just have to accept that that's the way it works. And in that sense, you know, Colin Rowe's argument that he sees it as the fashion trade of the construction industry, I think is, you know, also not wrong. That, in other words, that there are the Issey Miyake and those that are producing things that are in some sense unwearable, but nonetheless spark a change in the normative way in which clothing happens. And I think that that's our obligation to the building industry, is to basically do those experiments, and then, you know, they get taken over or absorbed or not, you know, into normative routine, at which point we should leave them as quickly as we discover them.
I don't know if this is a dumb question or not, but could architecture, does architecture limit yourself to only making buildings, or could you use that field in other career choices?
See the last 30 minutes? I hope not. You know, I mean, I think what you will be well trained at when you're done, or well educated in, and the reason I call it a discipline is because it has a very long history. I don't really care about history, but I think it's useful to have history as your ally and to misread history for current purposes. And that's a kind of contemporary, you know, mashup or mixture in terms of like, how do I redeploy this thing, which was used for some purpose, in a totally different way today? You know, that's like a Duchampian found object, or you know, an assisted ready-made. And so you know, I think that you will become strategic thinkers. I think architects are really good at being strategic thinkers because of, you know, you have the one professional education that has to do a whole sort of thing, which is what keeps you up at night. You're calculating things in physics and structures, and you're, you know, figuring out materials and how things go together, and making models and drawings, and doing history and theory, and writing papers. And it's it's not like other professions where you do one thing, you have to do all of it. So I think that architects are really super expert at being generalists, which I think is a good thing. I mean, to me, it means we're the last thinkers. And that therefore, architecture, people who have been trained or studied in architecture, educated in architecture, you may or may not get licensed. You may get licensed and not make a building, you may not get licensed and you may make a building, it's irrelevant. I mean, the point is how you conceive of problems, how you organize a whole set of incompatible demands and codes and desires and negotiating with different fabricators and clients to users and so on. And you will get really good at that, and it turns out that lots of fields like those kinds of people. And so you may end up in Hollywood in animation, or you may end up in business, you may end up, there's lots of places you could end up with that ability, but it's really a kind of way of thinking about problems and turning them on their head and inside out to figure out other solutions. It's really what's being taught. And you visualize it and materialize it a certain way, but that's one medium of it. So, no, not building. Whoever comes in here and says it's building, let me know. Not as Jerry Seinfeld would say that there's anything wrong with that.
As director of School of Architecture, how would you like to have this program different from like other architecture programs, and what direction would you like to see UIC School of Architecture program?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's... Next year I'll be all about going through the accreditation criteria. So this year I get a wild card. Next year it's going to be about something entirely different, and you won't even recognize me. You won't know who I am anymore. Tie, getting the whole thing going. Number 32, yes, we do that. Because you want to be accredited, and that's all nice and fun. But no, I think, again, what I said, that I think that this is a school that teaches the discipline, and I think that discipline is actually something that not many schools teach, because I think most schools imagine themselves committed to a kind of emergency market, and somehow, like the guy in the street bleeding, like there are things bleeding out there, and we need to stop the bleeding, not knowing if, in fact, we're even good at stopping bleeding or not. I think that what I'm not interested in producing is what I call a theme school, and I think there are a lot of theme schools that brand themselves according to current themes, meaning like, is it socially engaged, is it parametric, is it environmentally conscious, whatever the theme du jour is, they will say that's what their school is. The fact is they have no expertise in those things, they just figured that that's a recent theme and I better say that's what my school is about. And I think what that means is, there are more prosaic schools that say, it's about getting a job, and so we will train you in BIM because we know that boring Office X wants you to have that skill to get in the door. But the problem with boring Office X is that when that technology changes, like the poor antique car in front of Corbusier's house, you will be obsolete. You will be the painting of Dorian Gray, not Dorian Gray. You will have aged rapidly before everyone's eyes, and you will be quickly put out to the street into pasture because you will have been a technical plug-in for 2 or 3 years, and then your expertise, because it's merely of that kind of knowledge, will disappear. And so if you pursue themes, you've basically said, I've got a short-term game plan, and I'll be good for 3 years until that thing dies. If you learn a discipline, the point is a discipline teaches you ways to engage problems regardless of what they are that we can't predict yet. And so, that's why I think you need to learn a way of thinking and working that is not merely a reflection of a current presumed need or demand, but basically gives you legs because you will have careers that are 50 years long. That's what I mean by architecture is slow. And so to put you out in the world with something that has an expiration date of 6 months would be irresponsible of us. And so we have to say, we're in it for 50 years, and nobody knows what 50 years looks like. But what we can say is that this is a way of working that has shown viability in the past as a way of solving whatever new problems, technologies, markets, social domains come into play. You should be able to solve them. So to say that it's a discipline school to me is like that. It's a hard case to make, it's not a very market savvy, perhaps, case to make because, the other ones seem to have immediate, like Rice Krispies returns on them, like, oh, hit that button. But, we're not in it for the short term. And the future is unpredictable, so we need to teach you in a way that allows you to deal with unpredictability.
As an architect, I'm trying to figure out, there's a struggle between offering new ideas or bringing a new perspective with the fact that sometimes you have to be complacent with how society treats you and how you play a role in society.
So basically, the balance between having ideas that aren't yet accepted and the demands on you to do a particular task.
Yeah.
And how do you do it?
Is there a certain balance? Because at times you have to, if there's no innovation, if there's no creativity, then sometimes you're going to have to be able to do the things you want to do.
Right.
But at the same time, if you're involved into creating things that you're inspired, and at the same time trying to play your role in society. How the things that we can deal with right now might not be exactly the things that you can envision.
Well, that's why I think having a discipline is a good thing, because basically you get to keep a secret set of books on a project that are your own, regardless of what everybody else thinks you're doing. And I think you need to have a double set of books. The set of books that you show your client, patron, or whomever says, I'm doing those things, and then your secret set of books that when you meet with other friends and colleagues in architecture say, I'm doing this, can you imagine that I did this? Because I think that your audience, you can have a one-dimensional audience, in which case you'll become merely a service provider, or perhaps merely an artist. And so the issue of architecture about having to keep two sets of books, I think is, that's just part of the job description in a way. Something that's in it for them and something that's in it for you. And for you, for me, is always something that's in it for your attitude or approach to the field. So it's not totally idiosyncratic, it's your way of configuring the field. Sometimes things, it's also okay, clearly when sometimes it makes sense to take a job that doesn't seem to have much potential because of other things, and maybe you're just invested in one tiny part of it that no one else cares about, and it's worthwhile to do it for that, or for the connections it allows you to do other things later on. So I think you're always judging your career by being on the lazy side of things. I would like to say no to most jobs, and I will say there's nothing more liberating than firing a client every now and then when they think they know more than you, and it's like, we lost that job, that's great, because that was the pain. It's great to get jobs, but sometimes it's also really enjoyable to fire clients. Cedric Price said, this is the idea that Michael talks about, sometimes laziness is the best ally. But I think what he means is, Cedric Price, said, he had a couple that interviewed him to do a house for them. And he said, basically, Madam, sir, you don't need a house, you need a divorce. So basically the idea that the architect doesn't just build stuff, but he also gives marriage counseling. But sometimes a building is not the answer to a problem, but it doesn't mean you're out of a job. It means you need to think much more broadly about what you do as an architect. Not that, I lost a commission. It's like, I rethought their entire life.
Did you write any books?
Is my guilty conscience out there? I write books. I feel awful now. I try. some articles you may see at some point in time. Thank you. What's that? Oh, yeah.
You mentioned Mies van der Rohe a couple of times. What's your opinion about his architecture? Because personally, some of it I couldn't hate more.
A, it's good not in my accent.
You turned that into a commercial? Marvin, did you know that?
No, I didn't get him.
I happen to love Mies. I don't tell you at school that. So, yeah, I mean, there's another quote that, Paul Rudolph said about Mies. Mies was a great architect because he ignored so many problems. And I think that's also right, that there's a kind of bloody single-mindedness to a lot of architecture that is great. In other words, it highlights one thing and pushes everything else to the side. I think that's one way to figure out what's a different world. What if this were the dictating variable and everything else wasn't? I think that's one way of showing a future. So I think I also have to admit that I like Mies because of all of I can't think about Mies without thinking of all of the practices that I love that Mies inspired. From ones that look like nothing like Mies, like even the Venturis, but certainly Koolhaas and certainly lots of other practices that are inconceivable without Mies. And so I love Mies because of also the progeny that reread Mies and did something else with Mies. So, and you can't not like part of your family. I mean, you can have cousins that you don't really like, but they're still in your family. It's not like I get to exclude that part of the discipline. It's there. You may not want to spend a lot of time with them, and you may break your toys or whatever, but family's family.
What would you recommend students in order to reach a high level of experience in their line of work?
Travel. See as many things as possible. Be a sponge. Absorb as many influences, not just architectural, but all cultural ones, because I think part of what advances our field is its proximity to the advances in other cultural fields. We don't have to represent them, but I think that part of osmosis has to happen between looking at what someone else is doing in an advanced field and figuring out how that can be translated to your field. So I think curiosity, the drawing, all of the technical stuff, and even the language and vocabulary will come with time and hours. I mean, as Malcolm Gladwell says, genius is really just putting in X number of thousand hours in something and you become really good at it. I mean, it does take time, as our friend asked earlier. I mean, that's just, how it happens. You need a lot of time before it becomes automatic, in anything, sports, architecture, anything. So, but I think, how to prepare yourself for the highest level, just really expose yourself. Don't miss an opportunity to see somebody when they come to town. Go out of your way and go to IIT, and go to the Art Institute, and go to the Grant Foundation, look at exhibits, just immerse yourself. Thanks for the opportunity. It was fun. I'll see you again.